Hello everyone, and welcome back. This video is about the book Nexus, A Brief History of Information Networks from the Stone Age to AI, written by Yuval Noah Harari. The book was published this year, 2024. I was very excited to read it, and I'm now excited to discuss it with you. Before getting to that book, very quick update about my reading group, which meets every Saturday. We are finishing up our series of discussions of Capitalism and the Death Drive by Byung-Chul Han. We have decided the books for the first 3 months of 2025. They will be in the order in which we will approach them and discuss them. Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud, and The Entanglement, How Art and Philosophy Make Us What We Are by the philosopher Yuval Noah. Okay, turning to Nexus. As you might expect if you are familiar with Harari's approach, his type of project, the book offers a synthesis of a whole bunch of topics: history, religion, political theory, organization and bureaucracy, and artificial intelligence. It covers a lot of ground, and depending on your interest, you will focus on different parts of the book. In this overview of the book, review, overview, discussion, I've decided to mix my commentary with passages from the book. So we are going to actually go through a set of passages that I've selected, and I think that these passages get to some of what is at the heart of the book. And going through these with me is going to maybe help you decide if you'd like to read the book, or maybe it will be a way of reviewing if you have already read the book and would like to listen to my discussions. Early on in the book, Harari talks about two stories. The first one is the myth of Phaethon, which is about Phaethon, son of Helios, the sun god, who gains control over the chariot of the sun, rides the chariot, but then loses control of this powerful chariot and causes a lot of destructions on earth. The second story, in connection with that first story, he also brings in a reference to The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is a story and a poem by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This story is also about power, greed, the desire for power, and then also destruction. With reference to these two stories, he writes, quote, "The Phaethon myth and Goethe's poem misconstrue the way humans gain power. In both fables, a single human acquires enormous power, but is then corrupted by hubris and greed. The conclusion is that our flawed individual psychology makes us abuse power. What this crude analysis misses is that human power is never the outcome of individual initiative. Power always stems from cooperation between large numbers of humans." End quote. The point here is that an individual or a small group of individuals might leverage the power of large networks. But without an existing network of cooperation, without that network already existing there, the individual, the greedy individual, the power-hungry individual cannot become so powerful. And networks, those networks themselves are formed, according to Harari, on the basis of information, created and maintained by myths, documents, institutions, and now algorithms. Quote, "If we wish to avoid relinquishing power to a charismatic leader or an inscrutable AI, we must first gain a better understanding of what information is, how it helps to build human networks, and how it relates to truth and power." End quote. We are now getting to a kind of definition that Harari offers of information, what information is, and its relationship with truth on the one hand and order, political order, human group organization. He identifies one perspective or set of beliefs as the naive perspective, the naive position. Basically, the naive position is when we equate information with truth, accurate representation of reality, state of affairs. So let's read. Quote, contrary to what the naive view of information says, information has no essential link to truth, and its role in history isn't to represent a pre-existing reality. Rather, what information does is to create new realities by tying together disparate things. Its defining feature, the defining feature of information, is connection rather than representation. And information is whatever connects different points into a network. Information doesn't necessarily inform us about things, rather, it puts things in formation. Horoscopes put lovers in astrological formations. For example, when people read horoscopes, you might see people being divided into good matches, compatible romantic couples and incompatible romantic couples. So that's the kind of formation. So in that sense, horoscopes do contain information, and they have the ability to put people who believe in those assertions in formation. Propaganda broadcasts put voters in political formation or votes, and marching songs put soldiers in military formation, end quote. Jumping to the next passage. While each individual human is typically interested in knowing the truth about themselves and the world, large networks bind members and create order by relying on fictions and fantasies. That's how we got, for example, to Nazism and Stalinism. These were exceptionally powerful networks held together by exceptionally deluded ideas, end quote. Exceptionally deluded ideas that shaped the intersubjective human and social reality. Created. I mean, some people correctly take issue with Harari identifying these as fictions and fantasies, because it won't be fair to call an agreement, a political decision, a fiction. It's as he says elsewhere, these are ways of creating reality, putting things in formation. That dichotomy of fact and fiction, truthful, fictitious, that doesn't really get to the heart of what political realities are. But regardless of that, that's the view of what information is and its role. Later on in the book, Harari is talking about objective reality and subjective reality, and then a third type of reality. He writes, quote, some stories, in addition to the objective and the subjective reality, some stories are able to create a third level of reality, intersubjective reality. Whereas subjective things like pain exist in a single mind, intersubjective things like laws, gods, nations, corporations, and currencies exist in the nexus between large numbers of minds. More specifically, they exist in the stories people tell one another, end quote. So now just knowing that there is an intersubjective domain causes two problems, or it raises two questions. The first problem is the problem of what intersubjective fact gets to enter into that domain, because there might be some subjective facts, subjective assertions that fail to become intersubjective. The second problem is how to keep track of these intersubjective facts or realities, assuming that they enter into the domain of intersubjective reality. How do we remember and retrieve them, these items? One response to these questions is bureaucracy. So let's go back and read. Quote, bureaucracy is the way people in large organizations solved the retrieval problem and thereby created bigger and more powerful information networks. But like mythology, bureaucracy too tends to sacrifice truth for order. By inventing a new order and imposing it on the world, bureaucracy distorted people's understanding of the world in unique ways. Next passage. Quote, instead of focusing on understanding the world as it is, bureaucracy is often busy imposing a new and artificial order on the world. End quote. Next passage. Quote, documents, archives, forms, licenses, regulations, and other bureaucratic procedures have changed the way information flows in society, and with it, the way power works. This made it far more difficult to understand power, what is happening behind the closed door of offices and archives, where anonymous officials analyze and organize piles of documents and determine our fate with a stroke of a pen or a click of a mouse. You might be thinking about Kafka scenarios, the situations that Kafka describes in his novels, like the trial or the castle. The hidden bureaucratic forces that are at the same time difficult to understand, difficult to penetrate and access, and very influential. Going back, quote, it's not just that documents and archives made it easier for the central power to tax, judge, and conscript everybody. The difficulty of understanding bureaucratic power simultaneously made it harder for the masses to influence, resist, or evade the central authority. End quote. Now, talking about religion, the Catholic Church during the medieval period, he writes, the Church couldn't prevent the occasional freethinker from formulating heretical ideas. But because it controlled key nodes in the medieval information network, such as copying workshops, archives, libraries, it could prevent such a heretic from making and distributing 100 copies of her book. Jumping ahead, quote, during the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries CE, there were important Christian texts that saw women as equal to men and even authorized women to occupy leadership roles, like the Gospel of Mary or the Acts of Paul and Thecla. The latter text, Paul and Thecla, was written at about the same time as 1 Timothy, and for a time was extremely popular. It narrates the adventures of St. Paul and his female disciple Thecla, describing how Thecla not only performed numerous miracles, but also baptized herself with her own hands and often preached. For centuries, Thecla was one of the most revered Christian saints and was seen as evidence that women could baptize, preach, and lead Christian communities. Now, what happened to those kinds of documents? Before the Council of Hippo and Carthage, it wasn't clear that 1 Timothy was more authoritative than the Acts of Paul and Thecla. By choosing to include 1 Timothy in the recommendation list while rejecting the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the assembled bishops and theologians shaped Christian attitudes toward women down to the present day. End quote. So in general, the process of curation, like bureaucracy, like the curation of texts in a sacred collection of texts, was influential and at the same time hidden from view and protected. The group, the agents that were in charge of it were protected from interference. Continuing that on that topic, quote, while the Holy Book was seen as the ultimate source of authority, the process of curating the book placed real power in the hands of the curating institution. In Judaism, the canonization of the Old Testament and Mishnah went hand in hand with creating the institution of the rabbinate. In Christianity, the canonization of the New Testament went hand in hand with the creation of a unified Christian church. Christians trusted church officials because of what they read in the New Testament, but they had faith in the New Testament because this was what the bishops told them to read. The curation of information happens in our time too, both by humans who control media, the news, the public discourse, and by, more recently, artificial agents like social media algorithms. And the process of curation is in our time also similarly outside of our view. We get the the headlines, the highlights, and the news items. We don't get necessarily how those were selected for our viewing. Now, reading a passage about the quote-unquote decisions made by social media algorithms and the kind of judgment that could go along with it. Quote, a social media algorithm thinks it has discovered that humans like outrage, when in fact it is the algorithm itself that conditioned humans to produce and consume more outrage. Such biases result, on the one hand, from the computers discounting the full spectrum of human abilities, and on the other hand, from the computers discounting their own power to influence humans. Even if computers observe that almost all humans behave in a particular way, it doesn't mean humans are bound to behave like that. Maybe it just means that the computers themselves are rewarding such behavior while punishing and blocking alternatives. For computers to have a more accurate and responsible view of the world, they need to take into account their own power and impact. And for that to happen, the humans who currently engineer computers need to accept that they are not manufacturing new tools. They are unleashing new kinds of independent agents and potentially even new kinds of gods. End quote. So it's a bit of a hyperbolic language, but I think the point is valid. There are two historical events that Harari points to regarding this, with respect to this topic. The first one is a genocide, the Rohingya genocide of 2016 in Myanmar. I think it happened in 2016 and went on into 2017. And during this genocide, between 25,000 to 43,000 people were killed. And this was shaped by viral content on Facebook. The second event is the rise of the far right in Brazil and the election of Bolsonaro in 2018, influenced by viral content on YouTube. So we have talked so far about the subjective domain, the objective domain, intersubjective domain, and now Harari introduces a new concept, intercomputer reality. Quote, a lot of computers communicate with one another. They can create intercomputer realities, analogous to the intersubjective realities produced by networks of humans. These intercomputer realities may eventually become as powerful and as dangerous as human-made intersubjective myths. Just as intersubjective realities like money and gods can influence the physical reality outside of people's minds, so intercomputer realities can influence reality outside the computers. For example, social credit systems could create a new underclass of low credit people. Such a system may claim to merely discover the truth through an empirical and mathematical process of aggregating points to form an overall score. But how exactly would it define pro-social and anti-social behavior? What happens if such a system deducts points for criticizing government policies, for reading foreign literature, for practicing a minority religion, for having no religion, or for socializing with other low-credit people? As a thought experiment, consider what might happen when the new technology of the social credit system meets traditional religions. So the idea of social credit system that is governed and tracked by automated machines, automated agents, is a perfect example of intercomputer reality. Quote, social credit algorithms combined with ubiquitous surveillance technology now threaten to merge all status competitions into a single never-ending race. While the network is relentless and ubiquitous, it is also fallible. Yes, computers can gather unprecedented amounts of data on us, watching what we do 24 hours a day. And yes, they can identify patterns in the ocean of data with superhuman efficiency. But that does not mean that the computer network will always understand the world accurately. information isn't truth. A total surveillance system may form a very distorted understanding of the world and of human beings. Instead of discovering the truth about the world and about us, the network might use its immense power to create a new kind of world order and impose it on us. In the most extreme type of social credit systems, every person gets an overall reputation score that takes into account whatever they do and determines everything they can do. End quote. So this is a good place to quickly touch on the list of Harari's principles for the design of information networks. He argues that when we are designing these networks, these systems of tracking and monitoring and maintaining information, accumulating and maintaining information, we need to keep in mind these 4 principles. The first one is benevolence, which is a concern with the well-being of human beings. That concern with well-being must be built-in, a built-in feature. Second is decentralization. So that means no one place should have access to everything. The place that has access to our medical records shouldn't have access to our voting history, for example. The third principle is mutuality. The systems that keep track of us should not be completely obscure and inaccessible to us. We should also know about them. Fourth, surveillance systems must leave room for change and rest. So just like a good friend who doesn't judge you permanently, say, okay, you have done this, or maybe you have made a mistake, or so far until now you've had this maybe character flaw or weakness. That doesn't rule out the possibility that you might change. In the social reality, in the intersubjective reality, we give space to each other to both rest, and we have room. We assume that there is room around each person and each personality, potentially for them to change. That assumption about the possibility of change is an important feature of participating in a common social reality. So those are the 4 principles. All right, let's keep reading. The power of AI could supercharge existing conflicts, dividing humanity against itself. Just as in the 20th century, the Iron Curtain divided the rival powers in the Cold War, so in the 21st century, the Silicon Curtain might come to divide rival powers in a new global conflict. Because the AI arms race will produce ever more destructive weapons, even a small spark might ignite a cataclysmic conflagration. The Silicon Curtain might come to divide not one group of humans from another, but rather all humans from our new AI overlords. No matter where we live, we might find ourselves cocooned by a web of unfathomable algorithms that manage our lives, reshape our politics and culture, and even re-engineer our bodies and minds. While we can no longer comprehend the forces that control us, let alone stop them. Throughout this book, Harari emphasizes a distinction between organizations, institutions that have the capacity to correct their own errors. They have a self-correcting capacity. They can self-correct. And those, on the other hand, that don't show an interest in self-correcting, identifying and correcting their own errors. At the heart of this distinction is the choice between sacrificing power and order in the service of truth versus the opposite, sacrificing the truth in the service of maintaining power and existing order. One type of self-correcting system, and maybe this is a general feature of all self-correcting systems in different forms, is democracy. We read democracies that managed to survive the tumultuous 1960s, like the United States, Japan, and Italy, adopted far more successfully to the computer revolution of the 1970s and 1980s than either the communist regimes of Eastern Europe or the fascist holdouts of Southern Europe and South America. The most important human skill for surviving the 21st century is likely to be flexibility, and democracies are more flexible than totalitarian regimes. Dictators have always suffered from weak self-correcting mechanisms and have always been threatened by powerful subordinates. The rise of AI may greatly exacerbate these problems. The computer network presents dictators with an excruciating dilemma. They could decide to escape the clutches of their human underlings by trusting a supposedly infallible technology, in which case they might become the technology's puppet, or they could build a human institution to supervise the AI, but that institution might limit their own power too. Next, jumping ahead, we read, the acquisition of power allows a network to deal more effectively with threats coming from outside, but simultaneously increases the dangers that the network poses to itself. As a network becomes more powerful, imaginary terrors that exist only in the stories the network itself invents become potentially more dangerous than natural disasters. A modern state faced with drought or excessive rain can usually prevent this natural disaster from causing mass starvation among its citizens. But a modern state gripped by a man-made fantasy is capable of instigating man-made famines on an enormous scale, as happened in the USSR in the early 1930s. End quote. So as individuals, you and I pointed incorrectly. I said you and I. Our self-correcting capacity depends on being able to talk to people who have different viewpoints and receive our capacity to receive, being able to obtain evidence that can potentially be contrary to our beliefs. We cannot have that if we are cocooned inside our isolated networks, our echo chambers. And these information networks are sustained by digital technologies with very specific attributes, limitations, biases. Harari says that potentially there might be two technological styles, say the technological styles of Shanghai versus San Francisco, that might rise as two superpowers and become the basis of two different kinds of worldviews in the future because of the influence of the form of those media technologies and the biases that are built into them. Similar to Byung-Chul Han and Jonathan Haidt, Harari also alludes to the nomos of the earth. The Carl Schmitt introduced idea that is developed by Byung-Chul Han. The fact that we are embodied, but we are increasingly losing touch with our embodiment. Our bodies are losing touch with the physical world. Our identities are increasingly shaped by our online presence, our online activities, rather than by our presence and our activities in the physical world. So that's, I think, is a good reminder. My criticisms of this book are quite similar to the criticisms that I had when I read Sapiens. Sapiens is a book that I haven't yet talked about, and maybe I will talk about it on the channel. So both when I read that book and when I read this book, I felt like he writes really tight narratives. I mean, the narrative, he puts a lot of, he curates, as he describes the works of others. He also curates information, curates historical data, historical facts, and then he spins a narrative around them. But the narrative is really tight. He's imposing a very strict order on the facts that he is reviewing. What that does is it doesn't give the reader a lot of free space for maneuvering in thought, to play with different interpretations. He informs us, he tries to give us a lot of cautionary notes and commentaries. But as a result of his style, I think he doesn't ignite curiosity. And please feel free to disagree with me if you disagree or if you agree in the comments. I think an important consequence of his style is that it doesn't ignite much curiosity. And we can work backwards from that sign, from that symptom, that he doesn't really raise questions. The questions that he ends the book with are practical questions, like, what are we going to do? Are we going to have enough control over our technologies to save humanity from them? Or are we going to lose control and let humanity be destroyed and subordinated to our own creations? That's not really an intellectual curiosity. So you don't read his books and ask more questions. But as I said, that might just be my experience. He also doesn't discuss global capitalism. He warns against, in general, when he talks about problems, historical problems that were identified or misidentified in the past, he puts too much emphasis on the wrong kinds of problems, like witch hunts, like the persecution of the so-called kulaks, like the persecution of Jewish people in the Nazi regime. But there are problems that are legitimate problems, like the problem of global capitalism. And when people identify that as a problem, some people misidentify the problem of global capitalism and they just focus on the first part of that. They just think it's a problem of globalization. Globalism is the problem, not the combination, not the whole phrase. And when he talks about populism, he doesn't he doesn't pause on the fact that populist leaders touch on something that exists. There are discontents that they identify and they kind of label. Similar to what he does here. I mean, he doesn't do that thing. He doesn't do what populist leaders do. But at some abstract level, what he does is similar. He organizes affective realities. A populist leader looks at general discontents that might be heterogeneous, and he presents them as a homogeneous thing, that if you want to solve these problems, follow me because I will solve your discontent. I will address your discontent by solving this very particular problem that I think is the root cause of all those problems. If you like to read more about populism, there is a really good book by Ernesto Laclau. It's called On Populist Reason. It's a psychoanalytic treatment, philosophical and psychoanalytic treatment of populist reason. There's one similar problem in one of the passages that I read. When he defines information, he says its defining feature, the defining feature of information is connecting rather than representation. And information is whatever connects different points into a network. So that, Nexus, information comes and connects, but that misses something. It misses the fact that these two different points in the network sometimes desire to be connected. And that nexus is a response to that desire. So the nodes in a network, in addition to that connection, he doesn't really pay as much attention to. But the book is interesting, worth reading. Yeah, it is worth reading, but don't let it be the only book that you read. We could discuss it further if you like to address something that I haven't addressed in my review. Feel free to comment. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention, and I will speak with you in future videos. Bye for now.